Okay, so what we're going to be covering today is a topic called Role of Women and Women's Organizations, which is part of your general studies paper. So India is a deeply patriarchal society with very regressive ideas on the place of women. And many of these ideas come from what are called ancient Hindu texts and so on. And these ideas still circulate in Indian society on a large scale. But we are concerned with what the role of women and women's organizations have been and what role they play and have played in modern India. So we must begin then in some sense with the 19th century and what is known as the period of social reform, where there were several social reform movements, mainly in the fields of education, in the fields of trying to abolish sati, in the field of trying to allow widows to remarry. So widow remarriage, sati, education, largely late 19th century movements. And there are some figures that we need to remember when we are looking at these movements, like two names that come to mind immediately from Maharashtra are Savitribai Phule, who was a pioneer in women's and girls' education, and Pandita Ramabai, also a pioneer in women's and girls' education. And among the men, people like Ishwar Chandra Vidyasagar and Raja Ram Mohan Roy in Bengal. This social reform movement, however, was largely middle class, also largely urban, and largely Hindu, and of course, necessarily upper caste. And this kind of critique of these social reform movements, in some sense, which were tied up in many ways with the nationalist movement, being upper caste and upper class and largely Hindu, is recorded first in a wonderful feminist book that all of you should look at and read, which is called Recasting Women, edited by Kumkum Sangari and Sudesh Vaid in the late 80s, which shows that in many ways what we consider to be both the social reform movement and the nationalist movement being restrictive for women and also really referring to one class and one caste of women and really not paying attention to, say, for example, the Devadasi, the figure of the prostitute, or the figure of the rebel, the figure of the Adivasi woman or the Dalit woman, which is missing from this discourse of social reform and nationalism. The modern social organization of women, or what is known as the women's movement, really began in the 1970s. And the key moment that you need to remember from the modern women's movement is the Mathura rape case of 1972, in which Mathura, a tribal woman, was raped at a police station in Maharashtra. And there was a big case around it and also a very strong protest around it, because the judgment that came from the courts, from the High Court, in this case, actually worked against Mathura and claimed that as a tribal woman, she was promiscuous automatically and therefore could not have been raped. These are considered views that people have of Adivasis, which are racist, which are colonialist, which are also sexist, but it's the dominant view of Adivasi women. And this was a big case. In fact, some famous legal scholars in Delhi wrote a famous letter to the Chief Justice against this judgment. So that's the main important moment that is in many ways considered to be one of the opening moments of women's social organizing or women's feminist organizing in India in the early 70s, which is the Mathura rape case. And it's a case of custodial rape, because this is the rape of a tribal woman in a police station. And indeed, the women's movement throughout the 70s and 80s largely was an urban middle-class movement, yes, but it basically talked about violence against women. This violence was of different kinds. There was an anti-dowry struggle, an anti-sati struggle, an anti-domestic violence struggle, and a struggle against rape and other forms of sexual violence against women. So this was the main thrust in many ways of the women's movement, and necessarily, therefore, the women's movement's main engagement was with the law, in the sense that women tried to actually engage with the law, to push the law to recognize the structural violence against women in Indian society and in the law. And there are several achievements that women did manage in their engagement with the law, and some of these most remarkable ones that you need to remember for your answers are, for example, the Domestic Violence Act of 2000, which basically was a progressive law for women because it allowed women to continue to stay in the houses that they were staying in and not be thrown out, which was the main threat that they received from their husbands, which is why they never complained about domestic violence. Now a woman could complain and also continue to stay there. She had the rights to stay in her marital home. So that's the DV Act of 2000. There's the Hindu Succession Amendment Act of 2005, which allowed Hindu women the rights to inheritance, which was a massive move in India. For example, it led to an exponential rise in cases of, say, of inheritance in across India, but certainly, for example, say in a state like Haryana, where there was a huge set of cases where women demanded property. And then, of course, the third moment you can mark, there are many other moments, but the three main ones is what I'm talking about: domestic violence, Hindu Succession Amendment Act, and then the rape law being reformed in 2013 after the Delhi rape case of 2012, where we had something called the Verma Committee report, which actually came up with some excellent recommendations for changes in rape law. It expanded the understanding of rape. It did some amazing stuff with trying to make Indian law engage with the women's movement and engage with the women's questions. The other important development that happened around this time was the critique of the dominant. As I said, since the women's movement was largely seen as upper caste and upper class, there was a critique of the Indian women's movement from two fronts. One was from Dalit feminism, embodied centrally, for example, in a figure like Ruth Manorama from Karnataka, who raised the question as a Dalit woman of the predominantly Hindu and upper caste nature of the women's movement, but also from minority feminists like Flavia Agnes, a legal feminist based in Bombay, who is also Christian, who raised the question of religious minorities like Muslims and Christians not really being the focus of the Indian women's movement. In the latter part of the 90s, the other two critiques that came off with the women's movement and women's organizations were the ones from sexual minorities, from the LGBT community. LGBT is lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender. So, for example, in one of the famous conferences of the Indian Association of Women's Studies, the Tirupati conference, in fact, lesbian women raised the question of how the dominant women's movement was largely heterosexual and didn't pay attention to sexual minorities. And the other critique was from what is now known as the disability sector, where again the disabled women's movement basically said that the women's movement was largely ableist, or what they mean by that is that it did not take into account the lives and the struggles of disabled women. And one of the key women to write about this is a woman called Anita Ghai, who teaches in Delhi. The last sort of phase of the women's movement, which really begins with the 90s, which, as you know, is a time in which liberalization is what India has opened itself up to, the free market, the new phenomenon of globalization. In this moment, what happens is that the autonomous women's movement, which existed from the 70s to now, the autonomous meaning the independent women's movement, actually begins to decline. And what we have are the rise of NGOs, non-governmental organizations, and therefore of a certain kind of NGOized feminism, of a feminism that actually largely works through voluntarist non-governmental organizations that sometimes work with the state, sometimes work independently, and in many ways as a counter to the state or as a checks and balances sector on the state. But that has largely been women's movement in the late 90s and the 2000s, which has been unfortunate because it has led to the decline of the autonomous or the independent women's movement. Now there are lots of success stories from within the NGOized movement or the NGO government collaborative movement. For example, there's a wonderful movement called the Mahela Samaha, which was a government program really operationalized in several states in India, which did some extraordinary work in empowering women. and this worked with the government. Obviously, it was a government program, but also with NGOs and worked in collaboration. However, there is a need in some sense to revive the independent, autonomous women's movement, because unless we have an independent women's movement that brings a critique to the table that is not compromised by either the politics of NGOs or the politics of the government, we will not have a truly independent women's movement. So this is largely what needs to be covered in your answer on the question of the role of women and women's organizations in modern India.